Hello and welcome everyone to this webinar on racial trauma. My name is Kajani Belaidam. This webinar will provide information on racial trauma, what it looks like, how does it impact you, your families, and surroundings, and what can you do to cope. Thank you for joining me. If you have any questions, you can contact us at info.kujengafamily.org. Before I continue, I'd like to start off with the land acknowledgement. Kujenga Wellness Project acknowledges the lands and people of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation. We are thankful to be welcomed on these lands in friendship. The lands we are situated on are covered under the Williams Treaties and the traditional territory of the Mississauga, a branch of the Great Anishinaabeg Nation, including Algonquin, Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. So what is race? Race is referred to as a person or a group of people's physical characteristics that are assigned to a mutually exclusive category. Ethnic culture is referred to as shared practices and experiences. Racism is based on racial categories which are used to dominate and assign a group as superior and the other as inferior to justify inequity, exclusion, or domination. So when we look at racism, they may occur in three categories. The first is individual, which is directly, it's person against person. Cultural is a devaluation of one's cultural practices, and institutional is the discriminatory laws and policies. Other forms of discrimination are ethno-violence and cultural racism, where ethno-violence is defined as violence and intimidation directed at marginalized ethnic groups to be stigmatized by a dominant or host culture because of the ethnic group's inability to assimilate into the dominant culture. This threatens the dominant group's entitlement to society and community resources. Cultural racism is directed at one's language, culture, food, clothing, and etc. So what is racial trauma? It is an individual experience, but what we are learning is that trauma is also a community and family experience. While individuals may not experience the trauma themselves, they can re-experience the same feelings and symptoms through their family, their history, and generationally. Intergenerational trauma is when traumatic stressors or experiences are transferred from one generation to the next. It can be historical racist resources like oppression, genocide, and slavery, or personal trauma passed down to families and communities. Historical trauma is collectively shared among a specific ethnic or racial group. For example, Black communities' traumatic experiences of slavery that is felt and transcends generations, or colonization of indigenous lands in North America and around the world. The communal loss and source of trauma results in a high vulnerability of developing mental health issues. The exposure to and witnessing of racism, discrimination, and institutional racism has a profound impact on mental health of individuals and the communities who are exposed to it. Children exposed to or witnessed race trauma or racial incident can worry or be preoccupied with their own safety, their families, or that of their friends. Children tend to view media coverage or are exposed to a wide range of images and information via social media. They feel like they don't trust the police, and this can lead to anxiety and avoidance. It could also lead to distractibility and problems in school, fixated on events and trying to cope with or deal with the anxiety. So what does race-based traumatic stress look like? It is experiencing microaggression, denial of an issue, gaslighting, white fragility, surveillance, restrictions to access, and exclusion. Black, Indigenous, and people of color are the most vulnerable as they live in precarious systems of oppression and colonialism and social inequities. Powerful outgroup or the dominant race may feel threatened by these cultural practices and stigmatize marginalized ethnic groups. Racial trauma is multiplicative, where there are many other intersecting identities that result in experiencing multiple traumas. Clients are faced with multiple traumas based on multiple identity markers. For example, someone who is racialized, who is young, a woman, from a lower socioeconomic status, coming from a high priority or impoverished neighborhood. There are many identities here, and it each serves as a barrier to access for equitable supports and services. Next, we're going to look at racial microaggressions. So, what is racial microaggression? It is defined as brief, everyday occurrences of subtle, automatic put downs directed toward people of color. It's often automatic or unconscious. It's so pervasive and so subtle in daily conversations that it often gets dismissed or glossed over as being innocent or as a joke. Microaggression is invisible to the perpetrator and sometimes the recipient as well. People of color who respond to these microaggressions sometimes get labeled as oversensitive and building a mountain out of a molehill. It makes it difficult to identify the microaggression, especially when it seems like there are other explanations that are plausible. People of color on the receiving end have a vague feeling of being attacked or disrespected. Sometimes for some folks, it might be easier to handle obvious and overt acts of racism than a microaggression which are disguised. So we're going to look at the different types of microaggressions. The first is micro-inequities. It's described as patterns of being overlooked, not respected, and devalued because of one's race or gender. So for example, you're working on a project and you don't get credit for the work that you've done, or not being promoted after working many years at that company. Microassault is described as an explicit racial derogation that is often verbal and nonverbal attacks that are intended to hurt or harm someone by name calling, avoiding them, or purposefully discriminating them. Microassaults, insults are communications that are rude, insensitive, and demeaning an individual's racial heritage, history, and identity. So some examples look like when someone asks you, how did you get your job? Especially when you are a racialized person in a well-paid job or in a high-status position. To a racialized person, they perceive it as either people of color are not qualified or that they got the job through a specific program not because of their ability. This message conveys that racialized people's contributions are unimportant. Lastly, micro-invalidation is when communication excludes, negates, psychological thoughts, feelings, or lived experiences of racialized people. For example, as a racialized person, you are complimented for your ability to speak English well, or getting asked where you were born. This is essentially to negate your citizenship in Canada. Another example is when Black folks are told that someone doesn't see color or that all lives matter. So I'm going to take you through 9 categories of microaggression. So the first one is alien in your own land. So this is when racialized folks are assumed to be foreign born. So some of the questions can be, where are you from? Were you born here? You speak good English. Or asking a Tamil person to teach them words in their mother tongue. This message is sending someone that they're not Canadian. Ascription of intelligence is assigning intelligence on the basis of their race. So for example, you're so articulate, or asking an Asian person to help them with their math or science homework. Color blindness, for example, is when the dominant culture of white folks do not want to acknowledge your race. So for example, saying things like, there's only one race, the human race. This is denying individuals racial and cultural being or asking them to assimilate into a dominant culture. Criminality is assumption of criminal status is when a racialized person is presumed to be dangerous based on their race. So for example, a store owner following a racialized customer around the store. The next is denial of individual racism, when white folks deny their racial biases. So for example, saying things like, I'm not racist, I have Black friends. Myth of meritocracy, it asserts that race doesn't play a role in success. So for example, saying things like, everyone can succeed in this society if they work hard enough essentially saying that racialized people are lazy, incompetent, and need to work harder. Pathologizing cultural values or communication styles. So this describes as the values and communication styles of the dominant culture or the white culture is ideal. So asking a black person things like, why do you have to be so loud or animated? Just calm down. Or dismissing an individual for bringing up race or culture in work or school settings. This message conveys to either assimilate to the dominant culture or leave your cultural baggage behind you. Second class citizen is, as I previously gave an example of, is when a white person is given preferential treatment over a racialized person. So, for example, a racialized person who is a doctor or a surgeon is mistaken for a nurse or an orderly. This message conveys that racialized people are only capable of doing menial jobs and couldn't possibly occupy high status positions. An environmental microaggression looks like television shows or movies that do not have racialized representation, essentially saying that you're an outsider or that you don't exist. And these are some examples of what racial microaggressions look like. And over time, these things can have a very serious impact on your physical and mental health. So what are the effects and impacts of racial trauma? So race-related trauma can cause physical, emotional, psychological, mental, and spiritual stress. Major effects of racial and microaggression are anger, mistrust, and loss of self-esteem. Microaggressions are not minimally harmful, however, cumulative effects can be devastating. Other effects may include disassociation or hopelessness. Race-based discrimination can have a detrimental psychological effect where individuals experience post-traumatic stress-related symptoms. Racial trauma are forms of physical, emotional, and psychological abuse where verbal and physical assaults threatens one's personhood and affects their sense of self and well-being. The emotional and psychological threats to one's well-being can be sudden or systemic, intentional or not, vague and ambiguous, direct and specific, or vicariously. So often individuals who have experienced racial incidents experience post-traumatic-like symptoms. However, if racism is not identified as a root cause to one's trauma, then it goes unrecognized. So individuals of color or racialized folks are perceived as rude, arrogant, hypervigilant based on racial stereotypes, which minimizes their experiences and the effects of the assault, re-victimizing the individual. Whether experiencing racism directly or indirectly, like watching media and witnessing another person of the same ethnicity or race, this can look like watching things like or hearing about things like the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, or genocide of minority groups in various parts of the world. It can pose immediate or delayed PTSD symptoms. Sometimes microaggressive experiences of racism may not be recognized as it is difficult to define. Therefore, it can often lead to survivors of racism not being believed or supported and re-victimized. So these are some reactions or emotions to racial trauma. All of these reactions and emotions are valid. And these reactions and emotions to racial trauma is a normal response to an abnormal experience. So what are some things that you can do to cope with these challenges? So participating in therapy, exercising and relaxing. You can exercise alone, do a couple of squats, some lunges, or you can take a partner, a family member out for a light walk. Relaxation can look like meditation or yoga. Artistic expression in any means that you can, whether it be dance, singing, spoken words, drawing, or painting. Journaling is also a good strategy. Writing down how you feel, your emotions, your thoughts, how you behaved, what is happening within your body, physical changes that are happening when you feel these emotions, and what happens after. Journaling is a good way of reflecting on these emotions, thoughts, and behaviors, and perhaps even acknowledging what is happening. Building social support, so joining peer support groups and spiritual practices is also another great way of coping with strategies. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you for the opportunity to have me share with you today, and have a wonderful day.